This is Tamor Sane reading for reviewer Alessandro. The original release of Blizzard's Diablo sequel in 2000 was an inflection point for the nascent ARPG genre, defining the direction all games after it would take. But it's also a game that has been drastically improved on in the decades since its release, which makes its 2021 remaster a confusing re-release that is challenging to recommend over modern contemporaries outside of reasons of nostalgia or short-lived curiosity. Diablo II is a dungeon crawler, albeit stripped down to the genre's fundamental basics. You progress through the campaign over a series of acts, each contained within their own map. These maps have distinct areas and enemy-ridden dungeons you'll need to explore, eliminating scores of enemies that drop all sorts of color-coded loot that help you get more powerful as you go. The more you progress, the stronger you become, allowing you to deal the damage required to take down incredibly dangerous bosses that provide a challenging climax to each act. Where Diablo II differs strongly to its most recent entry, Diablo III, is in its role-playing. Here you're given 3 separate skill trees to invest points into, each of which will go a long way in defining what type of style your chosen class will take. You additionally need to manage staple role-playing attributes like strength, dexterity, vitality, and more, although these don't function as you might expect. Points in each mostly determine what gear you can equip, and not necessarily how much damage, physical, ranged, or magic, you deal. This can be initially counterintuitive to how you imagine each point invested will play out, with established Diablo 2 players already knowing that the majority of these points need to go into vitality and little else if you can already equip the items you need. This is an early indicator as to what type of remaster Diablo 2 Resurrected is. At its heart, it's a pure recreation of the original release, idiosyncrasies and all, with every bit of content that launched in the early 2000s. Its acts are incredibly meaty, with numerous quests, both mandatory and optional, to undertake, many of which require you to scour the expansive procedurally generated hubs that make up each act. Having these layouts change whenever you log back into the game gives each one a small degree of replayability, but only if you're looking to shake things up as you grind towards your next level in order to make more meaningful progress. Diablo 2's balancing hasn't been changed at all, which makes this a necessary routine. Especially as you progress into the harder difficulties, the gaps in its challenge become more apparent. Acts where you're tearing through regular enemies at a comfortable pace will come to a screeching halt when you encounter some bosses, who can wipe you out with just a handful of attacks. There's no warning beforehand that you're unprepared for the battle ahead, which only serves to make the penalty of death sting even more. You still drop gold and all your gear when you die, and having to daringly make your way back to your body to retrieve them remains as frustrating as it was originally. There is, in fact, very little that has changed mechanically in Diablo 2 Resurrected in a bid to retain as much of the classic feel as possible. There's so much about Diablo 2's design that is hidden from you, whether it's the lack of damage numbers letting you gauge the effectiveness of a gear change, or the puzzling reason behind your numerous missed attacks. The stamina bar also hasn't been tweaked, meaning a lot of the early game will require you to stop running and stare at it as it slowly fills up. This is thankfully negated after the first 2 acts as you start building up more vitality points, but never truly goes away unless you dedicate time to popping stamina potions frequently. Diablo 2's character builds with their respective strengths and weaknesses also have not changed, which means the game remains as punishing as ever should you not commit wholeheartedly to a specific type of build. The freedom of choice when it comes to which skills to level up is stripped away when you realize how rigid the overall difficulty forces you to be, punishing wayward choices hours later with few options to rectify them. You do get 1 free skill respec per character per difficulty, and can gain others through a lot of grinding, but it's an unwelcoming system for newcomers to the game, and especially fans looking to enjoy an earlier entry after starting with Diablo 3. On PC, you still don't have a dedicated hotbar for spells and abilities, and instead have the slots for left and right click actions. You can assign keys to specific abilities to rotate them into your right click slot, but it's nowhere near as elegant as a traditional hotbar that more modern ARPGs use to organize your abilities. You do get a dedicated hotbar when playing with a controller, letting you quickly cast abilities with up to 12 dedicated buttons. Using a controller, then, would surprisingly be the preferred way to play, had it not been for Diablo 2's reliance on accuracy when casting abilities, which controllers just aren't up to the task for in most cases. A controller is also a really poor way to navigate the inventory, which you will be doing a lot of the time. The control scheme sits in a weird middle ground, with neither one offering satisfying interpretations that is up to modern standards, and making actual play feel clunky in one regard or another. It's understandable why mechanics like these haven't been changed beyond the need to adhere to the original design, and it's easy to empathize with the notion that a classic like this shouldn't need to be altered, but it doesn't make the process of playing it any easier. Small creature comforts like stackable potions or more inventory space over the paltry amount you cannot upgrade would do wonders for removing a lot of the tedious back and forth travel you're forced to do between your objective and your inventory stash, for example. But that's not how Diablo 2 played, and that's why Diablo 2 Resurrected doesn't play that way either, which will either delight or weigh on you depending on your established love for its design choices. What has changed, and drastically so, is how Diablo 2 Resurrected looks. It's a striking transformation, with all the details and flourishes that modern hardware affords. Lightning spells fill the screen with their destructive arcing fury, while distinct details on the variety of nasty creatures you'll face come alive in a way that the pixelated original just couldn't possibly manage. The extent of the work done to the game can be appreciated by toggling back to the original presentation, which you can do with a press over button at any time. It's eye-opening to see how the game's tone and mood have hardly shifted, and just how powerful the dreary and hopeless feel of it all was beautifully communicated, even with the visual limitations of the mid-2000s. Diablo 2 Resurrected pulls off the delicate trick of looking like what your memories might think Diablo 2 looked like at launch, and consistently being a treat for the eyes. Some accessibility changes have also been made, such as aids for color blindness and increase in the legibility of the game's text. Graciously, gold pickups are now automatic, which removes some of the strain associated with clicking all the little piles that appear once you've killed a large group of enemies. Smaller changes like the ability to have text appear when an attack misses, or changing some key bindings from presses to holds, shows a willingness to allow modern sensibilities to creep in and improve on the experience of playing Diablo 2. And since they're all optional, they go a long way to welcoming new players while staying out of the way of returning ones. It's what makes the overall package such a confusing one to recommend. On the one hand, Diablo 2 Resurrected ticks all of the boxes that a modern remake should. It remains faithful to the original and doesn't mess with what came before, giving players familiar with Diablo 2 and its idiosyncrasies a new, strikingly gorgeous way to enjoy the adventure all over again. It's also a reminder in some ways of what was missing from Diablo 3, with its darker look and well-defined tone sure to appease those who found Blizzard's eventual sequel too bright and full of color. But on the other hand, it remains an unwelcoming experience for many players whose only reference to this series is its latest entry. Those who come from a background of being able to freely experiment with character builds whilst also reaping the rewards of a power fantasy associated with bombarding enemies with abilities at ease will struggle to appreciate the slower pace of Diablo 2's combat, while also feeling shackled by its rigid builds that don't forgive careless skill point spending. Resurrected feels squarely aimed at those who have already poured hundreds of hours into this genre-defining title, or those willing to do that additional homework of reading up on its quirks ahead of time to avoid falling into the trap of building a non-viable character. That's not to say that the adventure is without merit, and it's certainly great to have a way to play one of Blizzard's classics with a coat of paint that does its visual aesthetic justice so many years later. But outside of players already well versed with the game's age, design choices and imbalance, there's not a lot here outside of a history lesson for new players to enjoy.